Well, welcome to this Wednesday night meeting of Allegiance to the King. I'm Dan Gallagher. I get to teach tonight, so it's my privilege and honor. And I'm going to teach a teaching that I have called Facing the Giants. And there was a movie years ago. I happened to see it, and it kind of inspired me the other day when I was thinking through what to teach and what to share. And so again, this is Allegiance to the King, our website, a2kchurch.org. You can see that down at the bottom. This is our Wednesday night midweek fellowship. We also have fellowships on Sundays and also other gatherings during the week. So I invite you to explore that. And tonight we're going to talk about facing the giants. What does that even mean? Well, are giants real? You know, there's a lot of mythology. There's a lot of Clearly, I've got some pictures on here. Are they real? Are they fake? Tell you the truth, I don't know. But I can tell you that the idea of giants goes back into lore. And also there's even in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 6, there's a section which talks about individuals that have been translated as giants. So tonight we're going to talk about what it means to face the giants. When I talk about giants, a synonym for giants is something that's mammoth, huge, colossus, a behemoth, a leviathan. Um, God's people, the fact is, God's people, us, have always had to be facing giants. We've been confronted by giants of all different kinds. So when I'm speaking of a giant, I'm talking about something that is huge and enormous, strong and powerful, overwhelming and daunting, intimidating, or something that causes fear. Not necessarily a huge humanoid or monstrous being, but if there's something in your life that you have felt that is overwhelming at time, whatever that may be, maybe it's health, maybe it's finances, maybe it's a relationship issue, whatever it is, I'm going to use the metaphor of it being a giant because I believe God is in the business of defeating giants, but to defeat them, we have to face them. The fact of the matter is that there are mentions of giants in the Bible. And in Genesis chapter 4, it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, meaning in the days of Noah and also after Noah. And a lot of people don't understand that, but we do know that David later went up against a giant and Goliath. He was considered a giant, and so this is what it's referring to. There were Nephilim in the earth in those days, in the days of Noah, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. This is an entirely theological area where we could get trapped into the weeds. And what does this exactly mean? Some people think that it was the phrase sons of God means angelic beings left their spiritual state and actually interbreeded with humans. And there could be a significant case made for that. But the fact of the matter is, it says in verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on earth had become, and every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. Verse 5 is directly connected to verse 4. And so the result of this wickedness and the inclinations of man's heart was a direct result of what these angels, the sons of God, the phrase sons of God usually refers to created beings. So Jesus was considered a son of God. He was created by God. We're considered sons of God when we follow in the new creation. So just a little sidetrack there. But some teach that these were merely giants and evil. I don't necessarily follow that line, but I understand where people are coming from. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 22, and I'm making the case for the fact that there were been giants have been mentioned in the Bible a lot. In Numbers 13:22, it says they went up into the Negeb and came to Hebron. Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were there. Now, this is when the Israelites were first come, and Joshua and Caleb and the others spies went up into the land of Canaan to explore it. And this is what they encountered. The descendants of Anak were there. In verse 32 through verse 33, it says, so they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. So I think the case can be made that these were large humanoids. And there we saw the Nephilim. That's, remember, a connection back to Genesis 6, verse 4 and 5. The sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. In other words, these guys were big, and they caused fear in the hearts of all of these spies that had gone up. And we know, if you follow the story, we know that they brought a bad report, caused fear to go through the assembly of Israel. And as a result, those people had to spend 40 more years in the desert until that generation had died. Biblical giants. Names for biblical giants are the Nephilim. We've also seen the phrase Anak. They're Anakites. You can check Deuteronomy chapter 1 and chapters 2. They're also referred to as Emites. In Deuteronomy 2:10, you'll see where that connection is made. They were also called the sons of Rapha, or Rephaites. That's also a connection in Deuteronomy 2:20. Zumites in the same section of scripture. And there's also a possible link to Avites. So my point is that giants were there with Noah, the Nephilim, at minimal giants in evil, but I think it was more than that. We see the same lineage that comes through after the flood. The Israelites are confronted by them and essentially defeated by the fear of these people. In Goliath of Gath, he was killed by David in 1 Samuel. There's another giant mentioned, Ishbi Benob. He's killed by Abishai in 2 Samuel 21:16. Saph is killed by, now I may have mistyped this, but in 2 Samuel 21:18, you'll see Saph. Goliath the Gittite, that's not Goliath of Gath, that's another Goliath, because this Goliath was killed by Elihanan in 2 Samuel 21. And then there's a giant of Gath, and we know that's not Goliath because this giant was killed by Jonathan, son of Shimei, and you'll see that again in Deuteronomy 21:20. The point I want to make is God's people have been confronted by giants, and the purpose of giants is to instill fear, is to cause us to get off of God's program. Giants, metaphorically, in the old days, actually physically, but today, metaphorically, we're confronted by all kinds of giants. There's social giants, cultural giants, economic, religious, institutional, and personal giants that we have to face. Now, the things that I've got up here is the first one on the top right is all of the various religions of the world. In some cases, those are giants. I've mentioned earlier some family relations that I have that are basically being faced by a couple giants right now. We've also got the cultural or social with all of the sexual revolution, the trans, the gay, the lesbian, and all that that we're being confronted on. We've got economic giants. We've got Antifa and revolution and all that, lower right hand, drug addicts, homelessness. And then also we're just confronted by the bombardment of propaganda and Hollywood and those kinds of giants. So what do we need to do to defeat the giants? Because the fact is, God's people have always been faced by giants, either physical or another kind, one way or another. And I can think of just innumerable examples through the scriptures where there was all kinds of temptations and things that came against people. Some of the giant slayers that we've seen are Moses when he went up against Pharaoh in Egypt, Gideon facing 500,000 Midianites, David when he faced off with Goliath, and Jesus facing off with Satan. To defeat giants, there seems to be a few themes that I've seen. One of the common ones are God chooses weak people to do his fighting. And we'll see this when we go through and look at a couple specific examples. Remember the scriptures, it says God does not choose the wise of this world, or he chooses the lesser, he chooses the weak, he chooses the humble. And it's people generally that know they're not strong. You can't defeat these kinds of giants in our own strength. We've got to rely on God. And that's why God chooses people who are weak, and they know they're weak, and they know they can't do it without God. And what it does is it develops an intimacy, a craving for intimacy with God. Dependency on God is what it takes to defeat a giant. You have to depend on God, and depending on God promotes intimacy with him. I'd just like to stop for a second, and wherever you are, and if you're listening to this teaching, possibly just pause this teaching and reflect for yourself. What are some of the giants in your own personal life? And are you trying to defeat them in your own strength? Are you trying to come against these things by your own power? Because it doesn't work. God shows up best when he is able to show you that he's the one pulling it off. Well, let's just go and look at some of these. So here's Moses. In Exodus chapter 3, God speaks to Moses. He says, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" This in many ways would be like God coming to any one of us and saying, "Dan, Donna, Ray, Peter, George, I want you to go to Washington, D.C., and I want you to confront the president." Well, first of all, all the bureaucracy we'd have to go through to get there. But Moses was raised in Pharaoh's court. He knew the ways of Pharaoh. And here's Moses, 40 years following sheep, wandering in a desert. And finally, I think Moses, when he was a young man, tried to do it in his own strength and rally Israel behind him, because he knew he had been called to do that. He kills an Egyptian, escapes, and now 40 years later, he's completely humbled. And he says to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out?" He recognizes his weakness. But, Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" And then God in verse 12 gets a little frustrated with him. He says, "Now therefore go, and I will be your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." I love this record because God goes back and forth with Moses, and finally God gets a little frustrated with Moses, and he ends up sending Aaron to help him. And here's the picture of Moses parting the water. Quite a contrast from a man who at one point saying, "Who am I that I should go? Who am I to go up against this giant? What can I do, God?" And then here he is after this dependency. Look at the intimacy Moses had with God, the close relationship he had, to the point where, I mean, it was unquestionable. God tells him what to do. He's parting the Red Sea and all the other miracles. And eventually Moses gets to the place who says, that the Lord will send you another prophet like me. Moses was a forefigure of what Christ was going to be. But I love the records in Exodus 7 verses 6:20 and 40:16, because they say Moses and Aaron did exactly as the Lord commanded. And we know that wasn't 100% true, because Moses made God mad again and he wasn't able to enter the promised land. But the fact of the matter is, that's the record. They did exactly as the Lord commanded. And that's what you need if we're going to confront giants. Dependency. Gideon. So here's Gideon. He's got a land, and Midianites, like grasshoppers, every year are invading the land of Israel. And it says at some point he looks out and it's just this mass. They figure, I think at one point, I think the record may even say 500,000 of these people. They came in caravans, they came with camels, they covered the land, they stole the crops, they took everything. It says, "And the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? And he said to him, Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan's the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least of my father's house. And the Lord said to him, But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. Well, we know the record that it took, the water on the fleece and Gideon going back and forth with God to build up his courage and to do it. And eventually he takes all of these followers and he narrows it down to 300 men. There's a picture of the men drinking at the well or the water, and God sorts them all through and takes this army of Gideons and narrows it down to 300 men. And at that point, it's like, you want me to face this giant of an army with 300 men, but nevertheless, by Gideon developing a great intimacy with God because of his dependency on God, he defeated the Midianites with 300 men, and that record is in Judges 7, which reminds me of my brother Ray has been teaching on the book of Judges. So again, another example of to defeat giants requires great dependency. You have to accept your own weakness. You can't do it in your own strength, and you've got to completely depend on God to help bring you through. That's not saying you don't do anything, but you've got to depend on God and his strength and his might and his wisdom to show you how. And David is a classic example of a man going up against a giant. But here, David, it says, and David recognized it was only by God that he could go up against this giant. So out comes Goliath every morning, challenging the armies of Israel, blaspheming and slandering Israel and Yahweh. And so David, a young shepherd boy, comes and he goes up to King Saul and he says, Hey, I can do this. And they're all looking at him. His brothers are pounding down on him. And Saul said to David, You're not able to go up against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he's a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and I struck him and I killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions, plural, lions, and bears, plural. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. See, David had defeated many giants, bears and lions and tigers. Oh my, couldn't help it. But my point is, David's been out there. He's been up against this stuff, and he depended on God, which is clearly what he's saying to Saul. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David, we know, was a man after God's own heart. He had great intimacy with God, and it was because of his dependency. And it says repeatedly, David inquired of the Lord. David inquired of the Lord. It was his habit. It was his go-to. And that's how David was able to confront giants. Dependency comes first, and then we can have intimacy with God. Ephesians tells us, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. So it's not God, it's not self-dependence, it's God dependence. It's a declaration of dependence on God. We trust God, we depend on God, we live for God, and God over everything. This is what Jesus lived. And in John 5:30, he says, By myself, I can do nothing. Jesus was fully dependent on God. I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is just, for I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me. Clearly a description of an intimate relationship he had with God. And then in John 14:10, don't you believe I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you are not just mine. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. There was both dependency and intimacy with Christ and the Father. John 15:4, remain in me. Now he's speaking to his followers. Remain in me and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. The key to us facing the giants in our life, whatever that giant may be, and I'm using that again metaphorically, is you have got to be connected to the vine. We have got to depend on Christ and develop that intimacy with him, and then we can defeat any of our enemies. John 15:5, I'm the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So to defeat our giants, we must, and again, underline, must depend on God. This is what the Lord says in Jeremiah. Jeremiah repeats, this is what the Lord says, not the wise man boast of his wisdom, or the strong man boast of his strength, or the rich man boast of his riches. In other words, it's not going to be by your wisdom, your strength, your mental acuity. He says, but let him who boast about this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on the earth. For in these I delight, declares the Lord. If there's going to be any boasting, if there's going to be any defeating of giants, it's going to only be because of our dependency and intimacy with God. A.W. Tozer, I love this quote. He said, if you want to grow spiritually, you need to love what God loves and hate what God hates. I love the relationship that describes, that you have to have. And to defeat our giants, we must, I'm wrapping up here, but we must depend on God. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The people that know their God, the people that depend on God, and you will know him because you will develop an intimacy with him. Here's a couple final quotes. Oswald Chambers, God comes in where my helplessness begins. Remember, God chooses weak people, people that know, I can't do this without you. I don't want to do this without you. I need you in this. The more we depend on God, the more dependable we find he is. God reliance means to depend on God's limitless resources and for him to help us in every situation and time. God has promised to supply all our needs. What we don't have now, we don't need. It's kind of a reverse of, just thinking, it's like, well, if I really needed it, I'm sure it would be here. And I've been reading the book of Revelation recently. I'm just reflecting, and I'm just in the first chapters 3 and 4, and it's the 7 letters to the 7 churches, and I am overcome with how many times the word overcome and persistence and faithfulness is used. We've got to be overcomers. We can be more than conquerors when we depend on God. And again, relying on God has to begin all over again, every day, as if nothing had yet been done. Dependency on God is not something I can rely on what I did and what I've done in the past. The past is gone. It's irrelevant. Today is what counts. And I have got to depend on God all over again, today and every day. And if I do that, I'll be able to face the giants. You'll be able to face the giants, and we'll be able to defeat the giants. So in closing, I'd just like to say, I want to encourage you. Take some time. Look at every one of us has a giant. Don't pretend you don't have some giant that you're facing in your life, because we do, because it's the nature of life. But to defeat those giants, you have to face them. You've got to recognize your own weakness. You have to have 100% dependency on God. You will be able to develop an intimacy with God, and through that, you will be able to face the giant and defeat the giant.